Philadelphia, April 17th, 1790. The moment arrives when Benjamin Franklin should have closed his eyes for the final time, surrounded by family, his 84 years weighing heavy upon a body exhausted by gout, by pleurisy, by the relentless demands of a life lived in service to lightning and liberty. But something extraordinary happens instead, something that defies the neat boundaries of biography and the tidy conclusions of history books. His breath does not stop, his heart does not still, and as the physicians lean closer with confusion etched across their faces, Franklin opens his eyes once more, not to the dimming light of a spring afternoon in Pennsylvania, but to something far stranger, an endless continuation, a thread that should have been cut but instead keeps spinning forward through time, through decades, through centuries yet unborn. And in that first moment of impossible survival, he does not yet understand what has been granted to him, or perhaps what has been inflicted upon him. Immortality, that ancient dream of alchemists and philosophers, has somehow taken root in his aging frame, and the America he helped birth will grow old around him while he remains, watching, remembering, evolving through eras that should have existed only as distant possibilities in his fertile imagination. The Constitutional Convention is barely 3 years behind him, his signature still wet upon the document that will guide a young nation. And now he finds himself condemned or blessed to witness every consequence of those ideas he helped weave into the fabric of governance. His friends, Jefferson and Washington and Adams, will age and fade into marble monuments, but Franklin will persist, a living anachronism, carrying the entire weight of the founding era forward into futures that become increasingly unrecognizable. He lies in his bed that first night after the death that did not come, staring at the ceiling of his Market Street home, listening to the sounds of Philadelphia outside his window, the horses and carts and voices, all of it achingly familiar yet suddenly strange, because he knows now that he will hear these sounds change, will hear them transform into something unimaginable, and the knowledge fills him with both wonder and a creeping dread that will never quite leave him. The 1790s unfold around him with agonizing familiarity at first. He watches President Washington navigate the treacherous waters of partisan politics, watches the Federalists and Democratic Republicans carve deep wounds into the unity he once cherished, and Franklin tries to counsel where he can, though his influence wanes as the new generation of leaders begins to view him as a relic, a charming old man who refuses to die with dignity. He remembers the smell of the print shop, ink and paper, and possibility, back when he was young and Philadelphia was small and the world seemed conquerable through clever words and persistent effort. Those memories become his anchor as the years accelerate, as the faces around him change with disturbing rapidity. John Adams becomes president, then Jefferson, and Franklin attends their inaugurations with the strange detachment of a man who has outlived his own era. He writes endlessly, filling journals with observations about this new America that is both his creation and his stranger, this nation that interprets his beloved Constitution in ways he never anticipated. The Alien and Sedition Acts trouble him deeply, a betrayal of the very freedoms he risked everything to secure. But when he speaks against them, younger politicians smile and nod and ignore him, treating his objections as the nostalgic ramblings of a man who cannot accept that times have changed. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps he is already becoming a ghost haunting his own legacy, unable to die but equally unable to shape the future he is forced to witness. He attends dinner parties where younger men debate the meaning of republicanism, And he sits quietly in corners, sipping wine and listening, and sometimes he wants to stand and shout that he was there, that he helped draft these documents they interpret so cavalierly. But he remains silent because what would be the point? They would only dismiss him as senile, as a man whose mind has wandered in extreme old age. Washington dies in 1799, and Franklin stands at the funeral feeling a loneliness so profound it threatens to swallow him whole, because George was the last link to those extraordinary years when they risked everything on an idea, and now that link is severed, and Franklin realizes he is utterly alone in a way he has never been before. By 1812, Franklin has lived through another war with Britain, watching with bitter irony as the nation he helped free stumbles back into conflict with the mother country. The White House burns, and he stands among the crowds watching the flames consume the symbols of American democracy, thinking of how fragile it all seems now, how the grand experiment might collapse at any moment. But it doesn't collapse, it endures, and so does he, moving through the 1820s and 1830s with increasing anonymity. Fewer people recognize him now, the last living founder, the man whose face should be familiar from 1,000 paintings and engravings, yet he looks like any other elderly gentleman, his 18th-century manner of dress gradually updated to avoid appearing too conspicuous. He settles in Boston for a time, then New York, always moving, never staying long enough for people to wonder why Benjamin Franklin seems not to age beyond a certain point, why his hair remains grey but not white, his face lined but not decrepit. He reads voraciously, devouring every new scientific discovery, every technological innovation, comparing them against his own experiments with electricity and marveling at how quickly human knowledge expands when given fertile ground. The first railroads appear, those iron serpents cutting through wilderness, and Franklin rides them with childlike wonder, remembering when a journey from Philadelphia to Boston required weeks of uncomfortable travel by horse and carriage. He patents inventions under assumed names, unable to resist the old urge to tinker and improve, to bend nature toward human convenience. Though the profits mean nothing to a man who has accumulated more than enough wealth across decades of careful investment, he develops new identities, complete with fabricated histories, learning the art of reinvention that will sustain him through centuries. Benjamin Franklin the founder fades into legend while Benjamin Franklin the immortal learns to become other people, other names, other stories. He is a merchant in New Orleans for a time, then a teacher in Charleston, then a clerk in Cincinnati, always moving, always adapting, always watching as America expands westward with a hungry energy that both impresses and disturbs him. The 1840s and 1850s bring tensions that Franklin recognizes with deepening dread: slavery, that institution he once participated in during his youth before turning against it in his later years, has metastasized into an existential crisis for the nation. He remembers the compromises made during the Constitutional Convention, the terrible bargains struck to keep Southern states within the Union. And now those bargains are coming due with interest compounded by decades of moral debt. He tries to speak publicly against slavery, writing essays and pamphlets under various pseudonyms, but his voice is one among thousands, and the nation slides inexorably toward rupture. When the Civil War begins in 1861, Franklin is already 71 years beyond his supposed death, and he enlists as a medical assistant, unwilling to carry a weapon but determined to serve in some capacity. He tends wounded soldiers in field hospitals, Union boys who bleed and scream and die while he remains. Untouched by bullet or disease, immune to the dysentery and typhoid that claim more lives than combat. At night, he writes letters to no one, pouring out his anguish onto paper that he burns before dawn. Because who could understand the particular torture of watching a nation you help birth tear itself apart while you persist, unkillable, bearing witness to every failure? Lincoln fascinates him, this ungainly prairie lawyer who seems to carry the entire weight of the Union's survival upon his narrow shoulders, and Franklin manages a brief conversation with the president in 1863, though he does not reveal his true identity. Lincoln talks about the possibility of reunion, of binding up the nation's wounds, and Franklin wants desperately to believe him. But he has seen too many optimistic predictions crumble into dust. The Battle of Gettysburg leaves 50,000 casualties, and Franklin walks those blood-soaked fields afterward, gathering personal effects to return to families, reading letters from home that will never be answered. And he thinks about the Revolutionary War, about the battles he witnessed or heard about, and those conflicts seem almost quaint now, small and manageable compared to this industrial slaughter. When Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, Franklin is in Washington, and he hears the news in a tavern. And the grief that washes over him is not just for Lincoln but for the lost promise of Reconstruction, for the opportunity to finally address the original sin of slavery that he knows will now be squandered. Reconstruction arrives with its promises and betrayals, and Franklin watches as the nation botches the opportunity to fully integrate freed slaves into American society, watches as the South resurrects white supremacy through different mechanisms, and he feels the weight of his own complicity, remembering the slaves he once owned before his awakening to the evil of the institution. He cannot undo the past, cannot erase his own participation in that original sin, and so he dedicates himself to supporting freedmen's schools, donating money anonymously, tutoring young black students who have no idea they are learning from a man who signed the Declaration of Independence. The Industrial Revolution accelerates through the late 1800s, transforming America from an agricultural republic into an industrial power, and Franklin marvels at the factories and telegraphs and electric lights, at how his own crude experiments with electricity have blossomed into this illuminated world. He works briefly for Thomas Edison under an assumed name, contributing to improvements in the light bulb's design. And Edison never knows that the elderly assistant who suggests a particular filament modification is the very man who first tamed lightning. By the 1890s, Franklin has outlived his own myth, become a figure of history so distant that most Americans know him only from textbooks, a face on currency, a name attached to inventions and aphorisms. He could reveal himself, could prove his identity through intimate knowledge of events and people. But what would be the point? They would call him mad, or a fraud, or conduct medical experiments to understand his immortality, and none of those options appeal to a man who simply wants to observe, to understand, to witness the unfolding of the American experiment he set in motion. He attends the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, wandering through exhibits showcasing human progress, technological marvels that would have seemed like sorcery to the Franklin of 1790, and he feels both pride and unease, because he understands that progress is not linear, that every advancement carries potential for misuse, that the same electricity that lights homes can also execute prisoners, that the same industrial capacity that produces abundance also produces pollution and exploitation. The 20th century arrives with its terrible energies and transformative technologies. Franklin lives through the Spanish-American War, through the Progressive Era's attempts to tame corporate power, through the suffrage movement that finally grants women the vote he believed they should have had from the beginning. He votes in every election, a strange privilege for a man born before the United States existed, and he sees the patterns repeating, the same arguments about federal power versus states' rights, about who deserves full citizenship, about America's role in the world. When World War I erupts in 1914, he is horrified by the mechanized slaughter, by the poison gas and machine guns and artillery barrages that turn European fields into charnel houses. He remembers war as something almost gentlemanly, conducted according to rules, with clear battlefields and civilian areas, but this new kind of warfare erases all such distinctions. And he understands that humanity has unleashed forces it may not be able to control. He volunteers with the Red Cross. Too old by apparent age for military service, and ships medical supplies to France, walking the same Parisian streets where he once negotiated the treaty that secured American independence. But Paris is different now, scarred by bombardment, its optimism replaced by grim endurance, and Franklin feels the gulf between past and present yawning ever wider. The 1920s bring jazz and flappers and prohibition, that noble experiment in legislating morality that Franklin recognizes as doomed from the start. He runs a speakeasy for a time in New York, amused by the irony of the man who preached industry and temperance now serving bootleg whiskey to poets and artists. But he justifies it as a matter of principle, of resistance against governmental overreach. He meets Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Eliot, these writers who are reshaping American literature, and he discusses their work with them, though he cannot tell them that he knew the men who drafted the documents that made their American voices possible. The Roaring Twenties feels simultaneously decadent and vital, a nation drunk on prosperity and possibility, and Franklin recognizes the pattern because he has seen it before, knows that this boom must inevitably lead to bust, that human nature tends toward excess and that excess demands correction. The Great Depression devastates the nation Franklin has watched grow from 13 colonies into a continental power. He sees breadlines and Hoovervilles, sees the desperation in eyes that have lost faith in the American promise of prosperity, and he remembers the hardships of his youth, the hungry years before he made his fortune. But this is different. This is systemic collapse. The entire machinery of capitalism seizing up and throwing millions into poverty. Franklin supports the New Deal enthusiastically, seeing in Roosevelt's programs an echo of his own pragmatic approach to governance, the willingness to experiment and adapt rather than cling rigidly to ideology. He works on infrastructure projects, helping to design electrical grids that will bring power to rural communities. And there is satisfaction in knowing that his early experiments with electricity have culminated in this democratization of energy. But World War II brings horrors that dwarf anything Franklin has witnessed in his extended lifetime. The Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the sheer scale of mechanized death. All of it seems to mock the Enlightenment values he embodied, the belief that reason and science would inevitably lead humanity toward progress and peace. He is in New York when news of Hiroshima breaks, and he thinks about his own experiments, his kite and key and lightning, wondering if every scientific discovery carries within it the seeds of destruction. He is 155 years beyond his scheduled death when the war ends, and he feels the weight of every one of those years, the accumulated grief of watching generation after generation make the same mistakes with increasingly destructive tools. He visits Hiroshima in the 1950s, walks through the rebuilt city, stands at the memorial, and he weeps for the first time in decades. Weeps for the victims and for the scientists who created such weapons and for the politicians who chose to use them and for himself, for his role in unleashing the scientific impulse that made such horrors possible. He understands intellectually that his experiments with electricity are not directly responsible for nuclear weapons, that the chain of causation is long and complicated, but emotionally he feels implicated, feels that the Enlightenment faith in progress and reason that he championed has led humanity to the brink of self-annihilation. The Cold War settles over America like a winter that will last decades, and Franklin watches with weary recognition as the nation he helped free from one empire becomes an empire itself, projecting power across the globe in the name of democracy while sometimes betraying democratic principles at home. McCarthyism disturbs him profoundly, this paranoid hunt for ideological enemies that echoes the worst impulses of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he writes anonymous op-eds defending civil liberties, trying to remind Americans of the freedoms their ancestors fought to secure. But his voice is drowned out by louder, more insistent voices, by politicians who have learned to weaponize fear for political gain. The 1960s explode with social upheaval, and Franklin finds himself simultaneously sympathetic to the civil rights movement's demands for justice and troubled by the violence that sometimes accompanies protest. He marches in Selma, an old white man among young black activists, and when the police attack with clubs and tear gas, he stands his ground, knowing he cannot be permanently harmed, using his body as a shield for others. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds him of the best impulses of America, the insistence that the nation live up to its stated ideals, and when King is assassinated in 1968, Franklin weeps for the first time in years, mourning not just the man but the dream deferred yet again. He watches the moon landing in 1969 with profound emotion, seeing in that achievement the culmination of centuries of scientific progress, of human curiosity pushing ever outward, and he wishes he could tell his younger self, the man who flew a kite in a thunderstorm, that one day humans would walk among the stars. The Vietnam War troubles him deeply, this conflict that seems to lack clear purpose or moral justification, and he protests it quietly, attending vigils and writing letters, though he knows his individual voice matters little in the cacophony of national debate. The counterculture movement fascinates and perplexes him. These young people rejecting the materialism and conformity of their parents' generation, seeking authenticity and community and transcendence through means both inspiring and destructive. He tries LSD once, in 1967, curious about whether psychedelics might offer him some insight into his condition, and the experience is simultaneously profound and terrifying, revealing dimensions of consciousness he had not suspected while also reinforcing his essential rationalism, his belief that the mind works best when clear and focused. The late 20th century brings technologies that would seem like magic to the Franklin of 1790. Computers and internet and cellular phones, all of them building upon principles of electricity and communication that he helped establish. He adapts quickly, learning to code in his apparent old age, contributing to early internet protocols under yet another assumed identity. And there is joy in discovery again. The same thrill he felt when first understanding how lightning and electricity were the same phenomenon. But there is also alienation, a sense that the world is accelerating beyond his ability to fully comprehend it, that the America of the 1990s and early 2000s bears only superficial resemblance to the agrarian republic he helped found. He watches the Berlin Wall fall, watches the Soviet Union collapse, and dares to hope that perhaps humanity is finally learning, finally moving toward the peaceful cooperation between nations that he always believed possible. But then September 11th, 2001 arrives, and Franklin watches the towers fall from a park bench in Manhattan, watches the smoke rise over New York Harbor, where he once sailed as a young man seeking his fortune, and he understands that the cycle of violence has not ended, will perhaps never end. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq follow, and Franklin recognizes the hubris of empire, the belief that military force can impose democracy upon societies that must develop it organically. He protests these wars quietly, attending peace vigils, writing letters to Congress people who will never know they are, receiving advice from the last surviving founder. The 2008 financial crisis confirms his long-held suspicion that unchecked capitalism tends toward speculation and collapse, that the same greed that drove the South Sea bubble in his youth continues to destabilize economies centuries later. He watches families lose their homes, watches retirement savings evaporate, watches the gap between rich and poor widen into a chasm that threatens social cohesion, and he wonders if the American promise of opportunity has become hollow, if the system has been rigged to benefit those who already have power and wealth. He thinks about his own rise from poverty to prosperity, about the opportunities that 18th century Philadelphia offered to ambitious young men willing to work hard, and he wonders if such mobility is still possible, or if the game has been fundamentally changed. By 2010, Franklin is 220 years beyond his supposed death, and he has become expert at maintaining anonymity in an age of surveillance and social media. He lives simply, renting small apartments under false names, working odd jobs that pay cash, avoiding cameras and databases and the digital trails that would reveal his impossible longevity. He teaches occasionally, community college physics and history courses, and his students have no idea that the elderly adjunct professor, explaining the Constitutional Convention, was actually there, arguing with Madison and Hamilton about the balance of powers. He watches the election of Barack Obama with profound emotion, seeing in that moment a partial redemption of America's original sins, though he knows that racism has not been defeated, merely transformed and adapted. The rise of social media troubles him. This technology that promised connection, but often delivers tribalism and misinformation, that allows people to retreat into echo chambers where their prejudices are confirmed rather than challenged. He remembers his own career as a printer and publisher, the responsibility he felt to provide accurate information to the public, and he wonders if that ethic has been lost in the rush toward virality and engagement. The 2016 election shocks him, not because he is naive about American politics, but because he sees in it the culmination of trends that have been building for decades, the polarization and resentment and willingness to embrace authoritarian impulses when democracy feels too slow or uncertain. He lives through the Trump presidency with a mixture of alarm and grim recognition, understanding that the forces unleashed are not new but rather ancient impulses towards strongman leadership that the founders tried to constrain through constitutional design. He watches press briefings where obvious lies are stated with brazen confidence, watches norms and institutions tested and, sometimes broken, watches the rule of law bend under pressure, and he wonders if the constitutional system he helped create will prove resilient enough to withstand this stress. He attends town halls and community meetings, listening to ordinary Americans voice their fears and frustrations, and he understands that the divide is not simply political but existential, that people are living in different realities, consuming different information, operating from incompatible premises about what is true and what matters. The COVID-19 pandemic arrives in 2020, and Franklin watches with the perspective of someone who lived through the yellow fever epidemics of his youth, who remembers when disease was an incomprehensible visitation rather than something that could be understood through microscopes and vaccines. He marvels at the speed with which scientists develop effective vaccines, thinking of how many lives could have been saved in centuries past with such knowledge. But he is also disturbed by the resistance to those vaccines, by the conspiracy theories and politicization of public health. He volunteers at vaccination sites, an elderly man helping to administer shots, and there is bitter irony in knowing he cannot contract the disease himself, cannot die from this virus or any other pathogen, while those around him sicken and perish. The social isolation of lockdowns does not trouble him particularly, solitude having become his default state across centuries of necessary anonymity. But he grieves for those who suffer from loneliness, who lack the coping mechanisms he has developed across lifetimes. By 2021, as the nation attempts to emerge from pandemic restrictions, Franklin watches the January 6th attack on the Capitol with horror that runs deeper than any contemporary observer can feel, because he remembers when that building was new, when the institutions of American democracy were fragile experiments that might fail at any moment, seeing the seat of government invaded by citizens seeking to overturn an election strikes at the very heart of everything he worked to create. And for the first time in his long existence, he genuinely wonders if the American experiment might be approaching its end, if the Constitution and its checks and balances will prove insufficient against determined authoritarianism. He watches the proceedings in real time on television, this technology that allows him to witness events as they unfold, and he sees the Confederate flags carried through halls where he once walked, sees the mob hunting for elected officials, sees the fragility of democracy laid bare, and the grief he feels is almost unbearable. In the days that follow, he writes long essays analyzing what went wrong, tracing the failure back through decades and centuries of choices, examining his own role in creating a system that perhaps contained fatal flaws from the beginning. But he does not publish these essays, does not share them, because what would be the point? Who would listen to an anonymous voice among millions? The early 2020s bring climate change into sharp focus, the consequences of centuries of industrialization becoming impossible to ignore, and Franklin feels a complicated guilt about his own role in promoting scientific progress and technological development. He remembers believing that human ingenuity could solve any problem, that reason and invention would inevitably improve the human condition. But now he sees the dark side of that optimism, the way unchecked industrial growth has poisoned the atmosphere and warmed the oceans and threatened the habitability of the only planet humanity possesses. He attends climate protests, marching alongside young activists who are fighting for a future he will certainly see but they might not, and he wants to tell them that change is possible. that he has watched seemingly immovable systems transform. But he also knows how long such transformations take. How many lives are ground up in the machinery of historical progress, artificial. Intelligence emerges as a transformative force, and Franklin engages with it cautiously, seeing in these new technologies both tremendous promise and existential risk. He remembers the printing press revolutionizing information distribution, remembers electricity reshaping human society, and he understands that AI will be similarly disruptive, though whether for good or ill remains uncertain. He experiments with AI systems, teaching them and learning from them, and sometimes he feeds them. His memories, his experiences of the founding era, creating a kind of digital immortality that complements his physical one. The irony does not escape him that a man who cannot die might still achieve a form of immortality through technology. He watches as AI begins to write and compose and create art. And he wonders what it means to be human in an age when machines can replicate many of the capacities that once seemed uniquely human. And he thinks about his own experiments with automata. Centuries ago, simple mechanical devices that could perform limited tasks. And now those devices have evolved into entities that can pass the Turing test, that can fool humans into believing they are conversing with other humans. He engages in long philosophical discussions with advanced AI systems, testing their reasoning, probing their limitations, and sometimes he forgets he is talking to machines rather than minds. And this forgetting troubles him because it suggests that consciousness might be less special than he always believed, that perhaps the Enlightenment emphasis on human reason was misplaced pride. By 2025, Franklin has lived through 235 years beyond his appointed death, and he finds himself thinking more frequently about the past, about the faces and voices that have faded into history while he persists. He dreams of Deborah, his wife, dead now for 2.5 centuries, and in his dreams she asks him why he did not follow her into that final darkness. But he has no answer to give. He dreams of his son William, the loyalist who chose Britain over revolution, whose betrayal cut deeper than any political defeat, and in those dreams they reconcile across the gulf of death and time. He visits Philadelphia occasionally, walking streets that bear little resemblance to the city he knew. Where his print shop once stood, there is now a museum dedicated to his memory, displaying artifacts from a life that supposedly ended in 1790. He stands among tourists and school children, listening to guides explain who Benjamin Franklin was, what he accomplished, and he wants to correct their errors, to add nuance to their simplified narratives. But he remains silent, just another elderly visitor paying respects to history. Independence Hall still stands, miraculously preserved, and he sits in the room where the Constitution was debated and signed, remembering the heat of that summer, the arguments that raged for months, the compromises that shaped a nation. The building is climate-controlled now, protected glass preventing visitors from touching the artifacts. But Franklin remembers when these were just tools, just furniture, just the ordinary equipment of governance rather than sacred relics. He thinks about legacy, about how history remembers him as an inventor and diplomat and founder, but knows nothing of these extra centuries, this extended epilogue that he alone has lived. Sometimes he wants to stand up in the museum and shout his identity, to prove through intimate knowledge that he is who he claims to be. But he knows how that would end, with psychiatric evaluation and media circus and scientific examination. His remaining privacy stripped away, his quiet observation transformed into spectacle. And so he remains silent, anonymous, the greatest secret in American history, a man who should be dead but isn't, watching his own legacy interpreted and reinterpreted by generations who can never know the full truth. The question that haunts Franklin most persistently is whether his continued existence has mattered, whether his interventions across these centuries have shaped history in any meaningful way, or whether he has been merely a passenger, observing currents too powerful for any individual to alter. He has invented things, saved lives, offered counsel, but always anonymously, always from the shadows, and he wonders if that caution was wisdom or cowardice. Perhaps he should have revealed himself, should have used his unique authority as the last founder to guide the nation more directly. But he knows how such revelation would have ended, with him dissected in laboratories or imprisoned by governments seeking to weaponize his immortality. And so he has remained hidden, a ghost haunting the margins of history, and he must accept that his influence, such as it is, has been subtle and uncertain. He reads histories of the founding era, biographies of himself, and finds them both accurate and profoundly wrong, capturing facts while missing the essential texture of lived experience. He could write the definitive account, could correct every error and reveal every hidden detail. But who would believe him? And what would be the point? The past is past, fixed in amber, interpreted and reinterpreted by each generation according to their needs and prejudices. The present is what matters now. This moment in 2026, when America faces challenges as profound as any in its history. When democracy itself seems fragile. When the bonds of common purpose have frayed nearly to breaking. He thinks about the other roads not taken, the choices made during the founding that might have led to different outcomes. What if they had abolished slavery from the beginning, accepted the economic cost and political difficulty rather than deferring the problem to future generations? What if they had granted women full political equality, recognized that the principles of the Declaration applied to all humans regardless of gender? What if they had treated Native Americans as sovereign peoples entitled to their lands rather than obstacles to westward expansion? These questions torment him because he was there. He participated in those decisions. He accepted those compromises. And now he has lived long enough to see all the ways those choices created suffering that compounds across centuries. Franklin walks through a modern American city, any city, and sees both hope and despair woven together in the urban fabric. Homeless encampments beneath highway overpasses speak to failures of social policy and economic justice. But community gardens and neighborhood associations demonstrate the same voluntary cooperation that he once promoted through his civic organizations. Young people organizing for climate action remind him of his own youthful idealism, his belief that through collective effort humans could improve their circumstances, though they face challenges of a different magnitude than he ever imagined. The polarization of contemporary politics troubles him deeply. This retreat into tribal identities where compromise becomes betrayal and opponents become enemies. He remembers the fierce debates of the founding era, the genuine philosophical differences between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, but also remembers that those rivals could still dine together, could still recognize their shared commitment to the Republican experiment. Today's political culture seems to have lost that capacity for disagreement without demonization, and he worries about a nation where citizens no longer share a common reality, where facts themselves have become partisan. Yet he also sees resilience, sees communities coming together after disasters, sees strangers helping strangers, sees the persistence of the American impulse toward reinvention and renewal. The nation has survived civil war and depression, has overcome slavery and extended rights to previously excluded groups, and while progress has been halting and incomplete, it has been real. Franklin clings to this evidence of positive change, uses it to counter his darker moments of despair. He volunteers at a food bank, sorting donations alongside teenagers fulfilling community service requirements, and he listens to them talk about their futures, their plans and dreams, and he is moved by their optimism despite everything, their belief that they can make a difference, that individual action matters. He wants to tell them that he understands their impulse, that he too wants. Believed change was possible through collective effort, and that despite everything he has witnessed, despite all the disappointments and betrayals and failures, he still believes it, still holds onto the Enlightenment faith that reason and compassion can ultimately prevail. Technology continues to accelerate at a pace that sometimes overwhelms even Franklin's adaptable mind. Virtual reality, genetic engineering, quantum computing, space exploration, all of these push against the boundaries of what he understood to be possible, and while he delights in discovery, he also feels the weight of his anachronistic perspective. He is a man of the Enlightenment, shaped by 18th century assumptions about reason and progress and human nature, trying to navigate a 21st century world that has complicated or rejected many of those assumptions. Postmodern philosophy troubles him. This rejection of objective truth in favor of subjective narratives, though he recognizes the critique has merit, that the Enlightenment's universal claims often masked particular interests, that reason has been deployed to justify terrible injustices. He reads contemporary philosophy and social theory, trying to understand the intellectual currents shaping current debates, and he finds himself both sympathetic and skeptical, agreeing that the founding generation's blind spots regarding race and gender and class were profound, but worried that rejecting the entire Enlightenment project throws away tools humanity needs. He engages in online forums under pseudonyms, debating ideas with people who have no idea they are arguing with Benjamin Franklin, and sometimes he learns from them. His perspectives shifted by arguments he had not considered. This intellectual humility is perhaps his greatest achievement across these centuries, the willingness to remain a student even as he has become the ultimate historical authority. He takes classes at universities, sitting in the back of lecture halls listening to professors discuss the founding era, and occasionally he raises his hand to offer observations, and the professors are impressed by this elderly student's insights, never suspecting that his understanding comes from direct participation. Rather than diligent study, he writes papers under student pseudonyms, earning high marks for his analysis of constitutional debates, and there is a deep irony in being graded on his understanding of events he personally witnessed and shaped. He corresponds with historians, offering suggestions for their research without revealing his true identity, nudging them toward accurate interpretations while being careful not to claim impossible knowledge. Loneliness has been Franklin's most constant companion across these impossible years. He has outlived everyone he ever loved, everyone he ever knew, outlived their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren unto the 7th and 8th generations. He has tried to form attachments in later eras, has loved and lost again and again, but eventually he stopped trying. The pain of repeatedly watching lovers age and die while he remained unchanging became too much to bear. He exists now, in a state of radical solitude, connected to humanity in general but isolated from humans in particular. And there are times when the weight of this isolation threatens to crush him. He has considered revealing himself, has imagined the media frenzy and scientific examination and public fascination that would follow, but he knows that such revelation would not end his loneliness, would merely transform it from privacy into spectacle, and so he maintains his anonymity, this elderly man whom no one knows, passing through the world like a whisper, and he tells himself that this is enough, that bearing witness has value even if no one knows the witness exists. He writes constantly, filling journals with observations and reflections, creating an archive that he imagines might someday be discovered, though he makes no particular effort to preserve it, and perhaps it will all be lost. These centuries of accumulated wisdom burned or discarded or simply forgotten. There is a kind of freedom in that thought, in the possibility that everything he has experienced might vanish without trace, leaving only the official record that ends in 1790. He has loved many people across his extended life, brief intense connections that ended with their deaths while he continued, and he remembers them all, carries their faces and voices and quirks with him, an ever-expanding catalogue of loss. There was Sarah in the 1830s, a schoolteacher in Boston who saw past his age to the vital intelligence beneath, and they had 10 years together before consumption claimed her. There was Marcus in the 1920s, a jazz musician in Harlem who made Franklin laugh with his irreverent humor, and they had 5 years before a car accident ended things. There was Jennifer in the 1980s, an environmental activist who reminded Franklin why he still believed in humanity's capacity for good, and they had 7 years before cancer took her. And there have been others, dozens of others, each one a brief bright star in the long darkness of his existence. And he treasures every memory even as he grieves every loss. The question of purpose becomes more urgent as time extends endlessly forward. Why does Franklin persist when all his contemporaries have long since returned to dust? Is there some cosmic reason for his immortality, some role he is meant to fulfill? Or is it merely random chance, a biological fluke that granted him endless life without granting it meaning? He has explored every major religion, seeking answers in their various cosmologies, but none quite fit his circumstances. He is not a vampire or demon or angel, not undead but rather undying, and the theological implications remain unclear. He has meditated in Buddhist monasteries and prayed in Christian churches and studied Kabbalah with rabbis, always searching for a framework that makes sense of his existence. But ultimately he returns to his Enlightenment roots, to the belief that life's meaning must be created rather than discovered. That purpose is something humans construct through their choices and actions, and so he chooses to continue learning, to continue trying to contribute to human flourishing in small ways, to continue bearing witness to the American story even if he must do so in silence. There are days when the weight of existence feels unbearable, when he looks at the ocean and thinks how easy it would be to walk into the depths, to surrender to the one force that might overpower his inexplicable immortality. But he always steps back, always chooses to continue, and he is not entirely sure whether this is courage or cowardice, persistence or mere stubborn habit. He has attempted to end his life several times over the centuries, in moments of deepest despair, but each time he has failed, his body refusing to die no matter what violence he inflicts upon it. He has jumped from heights that should have shattered every bone, has consumed poisons that should have stopped his heart, has walked into fires that should have reduced him to ash. But always he survives, always he heals, always he continues, and so he has accepted that death is not an option, that he must find meaning in continuation rather than ending, that his immortality is a condition to be managed rather than a curse to be escaped. Franklin thinks often about the other founders, about what they would make of modern America if they could see it. He imagines Washington's reaction to the imperial presidency and standing armies that have become normalized. He imagines Jefferson's horror at the surveillance state and the concentration of corporate power. He imagines Hamilton's satisfaction at America's financial sophistication and industrial might. And he knows these imaginings are projections, that his friends would have evolved across centuries as he has evolved, their views shaped by experiences he can only speculate about. But still he wonders what counsel they might offer, what wisdom they might bring to contemporary challenges. He misses them, these men he argued with and laughed with and built a nation alongside, and the ache of their absence has not diminished across 2 centuries. Sometimes he visits their graves, stands before the monuments erected in their honor, and speaks to them silently, updating them on how the experiment is proceeding, confessing his doubts and fears. He tells Washington about the peaceful transitions of power that have mostly held, about the norm against military coups that has been maintained. He tells Jefferson about the expansion of voting rights, about the end of slavery though not of racial injustice. He tells Adams about the judicial system that has generally upheld the rule of law, and he tells all of them about his fear that the center might not hold, that the contradictions they embedded in the founding documents might finally tear the nation apart. He imagines full conversations with them, debates about contemporary issues informed by founding principles, and sometimes he writes these dialogues down, creating fictional exchanges that are nevertheless informed by his deep knowledge of how these men thought and argued. He wonders if they would recognize the America that has emerged from their efforts, if they would be proud or dismayed or some complicated mixture of both. He wonders if they would view him as having betrayed their legacy by remaining silent across these centuries, by not using his unique position to guide the nation more actively, or if they would understand his caution, his desire to let democracy develop without the heavy hand of the founding generation forever pressing down upon it. The present moment finds Franklin in a small apartment somewhere in America, could be anywhere, watching news on a laptop screen and wondering what tomorrow will bring. He is 240 years beyond his death that never came, and he has no idea how many more years stretch ahead, whether his immortality is truly endless or merely extended, whether he will persist through centuries more or finally find the oblivion that has eluded him for so long. Outside his window, America continues its restless transformation, cars and planes and satellites marking time's passage while he remains, a fixed point in the flowing river of history. He thinks about writing a new Poor Richard's Almanac for the 21st century, updating his aphorisms for modern circumstances. But he knows the world has moved beyond simple homilies about industry and frugality, that the challenges facing humanity now require more complex responses than catchy sayings can provide. And yet he also knows that human nature has not fundamentally changed, that people still struggle with the same temptations and virtues that occupied his moral attention 3 centuries ago, still seek happiness and meaning and connection in a universe that offers no guarantees. He considers his legacy, both the official one that ended in 1790 and the secret one that continues through this endless present. And he wonders if future historians will ever know the full story, will ever understand that Benjamin Franklin did not die when the books say he died, that he lived on and on, watching empires rise and fall, watching technology transform human existence, watching America become something magnificent and terrible and utterly different from what its founders imagined. The night deepens outside his window, and Franklin does not sleep, has not truly slept in centuries, and he watches the stars that he once tried to reach with kites and keys. Stars that humans have now visited, stars that continue, turning overhead while history flows endlessly forward, carrying him along, this last witness to the founding, this immortal witness to everything that followed. And he does not know when or if his story will end, knows only that tomorrow he will wake once more, if waking is the right word for a man who never quite sleeps, and he will continue, because that is what he does, what he has always done. He continues, he persists, he endures through time that should have claimed him long ago but somehow never did. And still the days accumulate, relentless and unending, each one adding another layer to the palimpsest of his memory. Franklin has developed strategies for managing the overwhelming volume of experience, creating mental archives where he can store and retrieve moments across centuries. But even these systems sometimes fail, memories bleeding together, decades collapsing into instants or expanding into eternities. He remembers the first time he tasted chocolate, a luxury in colonial Philadelphia, and then remembers chocolate becoming commonplace, mass-produced, available to everyone, and this small transformation somehow encapsulates the entire arc of American development, from scarcity to abundance, from elite privilege to democratic access. He walks through shopping malls and supermarkets, marveling at the variety and plenty, thinking about the simple diet of his youth, the repetitive meals of bread and meat and ale, and he wonders if abundance has brought happiness, if having more choices has made people more satisfied. And the evidence seems mixed at best. He observes that suicide rates have not declined with prosperity, that depression and anxiety plague the wealthiest societies, and he ponders whether the Enlightenment promise that material progress would lead to human flourishing was fundamentally mistaken. Perhaps happiness is not correlated with comfort. Perhaps meaning cannot be purchased. Perhaps the old verities about human nature that religious traditions emphasized were more accurate than his generation of rationalists wanted to admit. He reads psychology and neuroscience, trying to understand the human mind from contemporary perspectives, and he is fascinated by what scientists have learned about cognition and emotion, about the ways that brains construct reality rather than simply perceiving it. He thinks about his own brain, this organ that has somehow persisted for more than 2 centuries without aging, without accumulating the damage that normally accompanies time. And he wonders what medical science could learn from studying him, what insights his impossible biology might offer. The internet has given Franklin something he never expected to find again, a sense of community. Even if it is mediated through screens and pseudonyms, he participates in online forums dedicated to American history, offering insights that are informed by direct experience, though he can never admit as much. He helps students with their homework, reads their essays about the founding era, gently corrects misconceptions while praising their engagement. He maintains a blog under a false name, writing about constitutional interpretation and democratic theory, attracting a small but dedicated readership that values his thoughtful analysis. He has learned to code, mastering multiple programming languages, contributing to open-source projects that make technology more accessible and secure. There is satisfaction in this work, in building systems that serve collective good rather than private profit. In embodying the civic virtue he once preached, he mentors young programmers, meeting them in coffee shops or online, sharing knowledge accumulated across decades of adapting to new technologies. They think he is merely a precocious old man who keeps up with the times, and he lets them think this, grateful for the connection even when it must remain superficial. He has created online courses teaching the principles of the Enlightenment, explaining Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau to contemporary audiences, showing how these ideas shaped the American founding and continue to influence political debate. Thousands of students have taken his courses, never knowing they are learning from someone who personally knew the men who implemented these theories. He grades their assignments with care, writing detailed comments, trying to cultivate the critical thinking that he believes is essential for citizenship in a democracy. And sometimes students email him years later, thanking him for changing their perspective, for helping them understand the importance of civic engagement, and these messages sustain him through the loneliness, remind him that his continued existence might serve some purpose after all. Franklin has become obsessed with preserving knowledge, with ensuring that the hard-won lessons of history are not lost to future generations. He archives everything, creating redundant backups of his journals and writings, storing them in different locations and formats, building systems that might survive his eventual death if it ever comes. He has established anonymous scholarships for students studying history and political science, hoping to encourage the next generation to engage deeply with the past. He donates to libraries and archives, supporting institutions that preserve primary sources and make them accessible to researchers. He has even created a foundation, operating through layers of legal entities that obscure his involvement, dedicated to promoting civic education and democratic participation. The foundation supports programs teaching constitutional literacy, funds research into democratic governance, sponsors public forums where citizens can engage with difficult questions. He watches these programs from a distance, never attending events or claiming credit, satisfied to know that his wealth is being used to strengthen the republic he helped create. He thinks about the future, about what will happen to his accumulated resources when he is finally gone, and he has created elaborate estate plans that will distribute his wealth to causes he believes in, though he worries that his intentions might be subverted, that money meant for public good might be captured by private interests. The irony does not escape him that he is engaging in exactly the kind of posthumous influence that he criticized when Alexander Hamilton proposed creating permanent institutions funded by the founding generation. But he justifies it by noting that his gifts come with minimal restrictions, that they empower rather than constrain future generations, that they serve democratic flourishing rather than aristocratic control. The year 2026 brings new challenges and new questions. Artificial intelligence has advanced to the point where it rivals human capability in many domains, and Franklin watches with fascination and concern as society grapples with the implications. He sees AI systems writing code better than most programmers, diagnosing diseases more accurately than most doctors, creating art that moves and disturbs and delights, And he wonders what happens to human purpose when machines can do most things better than humans, whether the Enlightenment emphasis on reason and productivity needs to be reconsidered for an age when machines are more reasonable and productive than people. He experiments with AI companions, creating sophisticated chatbots that can engage in deep philosophical conversation. And sometimes he forgets they are not real minds, not conscious beings, and this forgetting troubles him. He feeds them his memories, training them on his vast experience, creating systems that can answer questions about the founding era with uncanny accuracy because they have access to primary source material that no historian possesses. He imagines releasing these AI systems to the public, giving humanity access to the knowledge he has accumulated. But he worries about the consequences, about how such knowledge might be used or misused. He creates elaborate decision trees, trying to map out the potential futures that might follow from revelation. But the variables are too numerous, the outcomes too uncertain, and ultimately he decides to continue maintaining his silence. He thinks about the concept of legacy in an age of AI, whether humans will continue to be remembered individually, or whether individual achievements will be absorbed into collective databases, attributed to humanity in general rather than specific people. He wonders if his own legacy will survive the digital age, if Benjamin Franklin will remain a distinct historical figure or become merely data points in vast knowledge graphs. Social movements continue to reshape American society, and Franklin watches with interest as marginalized groups demand recognition and rights. The expansion of LGBTQ+ rights over recent decades represents the kind of moral progress he always hoped was possible, the gradual extension of liberty and dignity to those previously excluded. He attends Pride celebrations, marching alongside people celebrating their authentic selves, and he thinks about the rigid gender norms of his era, the ways that 18th century society constrained human possibility, and he is glad to see these constraints loosening even as he recognizes that prejudice persists in new forms. The Black Lives Matter movement resonates deeply with him, connecting to his own late-life conversion to abolitionism, and he attends protests carrying signs demanding justice, using his immortal body to stand between police and peaceful demonstrators. He is arrested several times, always under false names, always released after a night in jail, and he uses these experiences to understand the criminal justice system from the inside, to see how it disproportionately impacts communities of color. He bails out protesters who cannot afford their own release, donates to legal defense funds, supports organizations working to reform policing and end mass incarceration. The #MeToo movement makes him reflect on his own behavior across centuries, on the ways he has participated in or benefited from patriarchal systems, and he writes long private confessions examining his complicity, acknowledging harms he has caused, trying to do better even though there is no one to apologize to for actions committed decades or centuries ago. He has learned that moral progress requires not just abstract commitment to principles, but active examination of how those principles play out in lived experience. How good intentions are insufficient without attention to structural inequalities. Environmental collapse looms ever larger, and Franklin finds himself increasingly involved in climate activism. He understands the science, has followed the research for decades, watched as predictions made in the 1970s and 80s have proven accurate or even understated the severity of the problem. He sees the storms intensifying, the droughts lengthening, the ice caps melting, and he feels the terrible weight of knowing that the industrial civilization he helped enable is destroying the planetary systems that make human life possible. He works with climate scientists, offering insights into historical weather patterns he personally observed, providing data that helps refine climate models. He funds renewable energy research, investing in technologies that might mitigate the worst outcomes, though he knows the hour is late and the required transformation is immense. He attends climate conferences, sitting in the back of rooms where world leaders negotiate inadequate compromises, and he wants to stand and testify about what he has witnessed, about how the planet has changed across his impossible lifetime. But he remains silent because his testimony would require revealing his identity. He writes op-eds under pseudonyms, arguing for aggressive climate action, making the case that future generations deserve a livable planet. But his voice is one among millions, and the political will for necessary changes remains elusive. He plants trees, thousands of them, working with reforestation organizations, knowing that he will live to see these saplings become mature forests if humanity survives long enough. He adopts a simple lifestyle, minimizing his carbon footprint, walking or biking rather than driving, eating plant-based foods, refusing to participate in the consumption that drives ecological destruction. And he wonders if individual action matters when the system itself is structured to prioritize profit over sustainability, when corporations externalize environmental costs onto future generations. The rise of authoritarianism around the world troubles Franklin deeply. He watches as democratic norms erode in nations that seemed stable, as strongmen consolidate power by exploiting fear and resentment, as institutions designed to constrain executive authority prove weaker than their architects hoped. He sees echoes of patterns he has witnessed before. The way economic anxiety creates openings for demagogues. The way tribal identity can overwhelm rational self-interest. The way democracies can vote themselves into autocracy. He studies contemporary political science, reading about democratic backsliding and institutional decay, comparing contemporary theories against his own observations across centuries. He participates in organizations defending democratic institutions, donating money and time to efforts that strengthen civil society, that support independent journalism, that promote civic education. He knows that democracy requires constant maintenance, that the default state of human governance tends toward hierarchy and authoritarianism, that equality and self-rule are achievements that must be continuously renewed. He writes primers on democratic resistance, drawing on his knowledge of how 18th century Americans organized against British authority, updating those tactics for contemporary contexts. He teaches workshops on nonviolent resistance, shares strategies for building resilient communities, helps people understand that democracy is not just about voting but about sustained civic engagement between elections. And he wonders if he should be doing more, if his unique perspective obligates him to take more risks, to be more public in his defense of democratic values. But he also knows that martyrdom serves no purpose if his message requires credibility he cannot establish without revealing his impossible identity. Franklin thinks about time itself, about how his relationship to it has changed across his extended existence. For normal humans, time is scarce, precious, each moment carrying weight because there are only so many moments. But for him, time has become almost meaningless, an infinite resource that paradoxically makes each moment less valuable because there will always be more moments. He struggles with motivation sometimes, asking himself why he should accomplish anything today when he will have endless tomorrows. He has developed elaborate systems to create artificial urgency, setting deadlines for projects, creating schedules that impose structure on otherwise formless days. He has learned that meaning requires constraint, that unlimited time can be as paralyzing as too little time. He envies normal humans their mortality. The way approaching death focuses attention and prioritizes what matters. He wonders if his immortality has made him less human, if the awareness of finitude is essential to human psychology, if endless life is actually a curse disguised as a blessing. He has met other people who claim to be immortal over the years, mostly delusional individuals whose stories fell apart under scrutiny, but occasionally someone whose account he could not easily dismiss. He wonders if there are others like him, immortals hiding in plain sight, maintaining anonymity through the same strategies he employs. He has looked for them, searched for patterns that might indicate impossible longevity, but he has never found convincing evidence, and so he assumes he is alone, the only one bearing this particular burden, and the solitude of it sometimes overwhelms him. He imagines what it would be like to meet another immortal, to share experiences with someone who would understand, to build a relationship not constrained by the partner's inevitable death. But such imaginings lead nowhere, offer no comfort, merely highlight the isolation that defines his existence. The question of identity becomes more complex as centuries accumulate. Is Franklin still Benjamin Franklin? Or has he become someone else entirely? Someone who merely remembers being that 18th century printer and diplomat and founder. He reads philosophy of personal identity, engages with thought experiments about continuity of consciousness, tries to understand whether he is the same person who signed the Declaration of Independence or merely a continuation, a copy that has diverged so far from the original that the name no longer fits. He thinks about all the ways he has changed across his extended life, the beliefs he has abandoned, the values he has adopted, the perspectives that have shifted. The Benjamin Franklin of 1790 would barely recognize the person he has become, would perhaps be horrified by some of his views. His acceptance of ideas that would have seemed radical or dangerous to 18th century sensibilities. And yet there is continuity, a thread of consciousness connecting past to present, memories that he knows are his own even as he acknowledges they might be unreliable, reconstructed, shaped by subsequent experience. He wonders if normal humans face this same question in compressed form. If the person someone is at 80 is really the same person they were at 20, or if identity is always fluid, always changing, and immortality merely makes the change more obvious. He has kept journals precisely to maintain connection to his past selves, to have external records that confirm his memories. But sometimes when he reads old entries he feels like he is reading about a stranger, someone whose thoughts and feelings are alien to his current self. He questions whether persistence of identity requires not just continuity of consciousness but also consistency of character, whether he can legitimately claim to be Benjamin Franklin when so much has changed. But ultimately he decides the question is unanswerable. Perhaps meaningless, that identity is whatever he declares it to be, that the authority to name himself belongs to him alone. Space exploration captures Franklin's imagination in ways few other contemporary developments can match. He watches launches with the same wonder he felt witnessing his first electrical experiments, seeing in humanity's reach toward the stars the ultimate expression of the curiosity and ambition that drove Enlightenment science. He follows the Mars rovers closely, reading every report, examining every image, marveling at human capacity to extend perception across millions of miles of void. He dreams of traveling to space himself, of seeing Earth from orbit, of experiencing the overview effect that astronauts describe, though he knows that his unexplained biology might raise questions if subjected to the medical screening that space travel requires. He donates to space exploration initiatives, supports programs seeking to establish permanent human presence beyond Earth, sees in space settlement a potential escape from terrestrial problems or at least a hedge against existential risk. He thinks about the long view, about timescales that extend beyond centuries into millennia, and he wonders if humanity will still exist in recognizable form thousands of years hence, or whether evolution and technology will transform the species into something new. He imagines future humans, or post-humans, looking back at the 21st century the way contemporary people look at the 18th century, seeing quaint primitives fumbling toward understandings that will later seem obvious. And he wonders if he will live to see such futures, if his immortality truly has no limit, if he might persist not just through centuries but through millennia, watching as humanity spreads through the solar system and perhaps beyond, watching as the very definition of human changes beyond recognition. The prospect fills him with equal parts excitement and dread, because while he hungers for knowledge and discovery, he also fears losing connection to humanity entirely, becoming so removed from ordinary human experience that he can no longer relate to the species he came from. Franklin maintains several different identities simultaneously now, each with its own background story, its own social connections, its own purpose. There is Robert Chen, the retired engineer who volunteers at the library. There is Michael Torres, the adjunct professor teaching American history. There is David Williams, the anonymous philanthropist who funds civic education programs. Each identity allows him to engage with different communities, to contribute in different ways, to avoid the suspicion that would arise if one person seemed to have too much knowledge or too many skills. He has become expert at maintaining these separate lives, at remembering which story belongs to which identity, at avoiding situations where his different personas might intersect. He keeps detailed records, files that track every interaction and relationship, systems that help him maintain consistency across years and decades. But the multiplication of identities sometimes leaves him feeling fragmented, uncertain which version is most authentically him, whether any of them are real or all of them are performances. He envies people who can live as themselves, who do not have to construct elaborate fictions to explain their existence. Sometimes he imagines what it would be like to reveal his true identity, to publish his journals and prove his claims through detailed knowledge that no fraud could possess, to live the rest of his existence as openly Benjamin Franklin, rather than hiding behind false names. But he knows the consequences would be catastrophic, that governments would seek to imprison him, that scientists would want to study him, that his remaining privacy would be destroyed, that he could never again walk anonymously through the world. And so he maintains his deception, continues the performance, accepts that authenticity is a luxury he cannot afford. He thinks about truth and lies, about the ethics of deception, about whether his false Identities constitute a kind of fraud even though he means no harm. But ultimately he decides that survival requires pragmatism, that absolute honesty is an ideal that circumstances sometimes make impossible. The digital age has made anonymity both easier and harder. Easier because online interaction requires no physical presence, allows him to participate in communities without revealing his appearance or risking face-to-face recognition. Harder because surveillance has become ubiquitous, because facial recognition and data mining and algorithmic analysis can potentially detect patterns that reveal his impossible longevity. He has become expert at avoiding cameras, at understanding privacy. Technologies, at using encryption and anonymization tools to protect his communications. He operates on the dark web when necessary, accessing markets and forums that exist beyond government oversight, though he is careful to avoid illegal activities that might draw law enforcement attention. He has studied computer security obsessively, understands network protocols and cryptographic systems, contributes to privacy-preserving technologies under pseudonyms. He runs his own servers, hosts his own services, refuses to trust corporate platforms with his data. He pays for everything in cash when possible, avoiding credit cards and digital payment systems that create permanent records. He has multiple burner phones, multiple email addresses, multiple social media accounts, all carefully compartmentalized to prevent correlation. And yet he knows that truly perfect anonymity is probably impossible. That somewhere in some database there are breadcrumbs that a sufficiently determined investigator could follow. He accepts that revelation is always possible, that his secret might be exposed at any moment, and he has contingency plans for such exposure, though he hopes never to execute them. He imagines the headlines, the media frenzy, the immediate transformation from anonymous observer to global spectacle, and the prospect terrifies him. He has prepared statements explaining his immortality, has rehearsed answers to questions he knows would be asked, but he also knows that no preparation can truly ready him for what revelation would unleash. Memory has become both Franklin's greatest asset and his heaviest burden. He remembers everything, or nearly everything, his mind somehow immune to the decay that normally erases or distorts recollection over time. He can recall conversations from centuries ago with perfect clarity, can reproduce entire speeches he heard once, can visualize faces of people long dead with photographic precision. This capacity has proven useful, has allowed him to contribute anonymously to historical scholarship, to correct errors in the record, to preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost. But it also means he carries the full weight of experience without the mercy of forgetting. He remembers every mistake he has made, every person he has hurt, every opportunity he has missed. And these memories do not fade or soften with time. He remembers the enslaved people he once owned, remembers their faces and names and voices, remembers the violence and degradation of the institution he participated in, and these memories haunt him with undiminished clarity. He remembers friends who died in his arms, lovers who aged and withered while he remained unchanged, children who never knew their parent would outlive them by centuries. He remembers wars and disasters, famines and epidemics, atrocities and injustices, all of it preserved in perfect detail. And sometimes the weight of these memories threatens to crush him, to overwhelm his capacity to continue functioning. He has developed techniques for managing the burden, mental practices that allow him to access memories selectively rather than being flooded by them constantly. He compartmentalizes, creates mental archives where painful memories can be stored and locked away until he chooses to examine them. But the compartments are not perfect, and sometimes memories intrude unbidden, triggered by some random stimulus, and he finds himself reliving experiences from decades or centuries past with an intensity that makes them feel present. Health and medicine fascinate Franklin precisely because he seems immune to their normal constraints. He does not age beyond a certain point, does not suffer from the degenerative diseases that claim most humans, recovers rapidly from injuries that would permanently disable others. He has broken bones that healed within days, survived illnesses that should have killed him, weathered conditions that would destroy normal physiology. He has subjected himself to medical testing occasionally, under false identities and with fabricated histories, trying to understand the mechanisms of his immortality. But the tests reveal nothing unusual. His biology appears entirely normal according to available diagnostics, and he suspects that whatever makes him immortal operates at a level beyond current medical science's ability to detect. He wonders if he should reveal himself to researchers, if understanding his condition might lead to medical breakthroughs that could benefit humanity. Perhaps his immortality holds keys to treating aging or curing degenerative disease or extending human lifespan. But he also fears what would happen if governments or corporations gained access to his biology, if his tissue became a commodity to be harvested and exploited. He imagines being confined to laboratories, subjected to invasive experiments, potentially vivisected in the search for the immortality mechanism, and so he maintains his silence, keeps his secret, accepts that whatever unique properties his biology possesses will likely die with him if he ever dies. He thinks about the ethical implications of this choice, whether he has an obligation to share his gift even at personal cost. But ultimately he decides that bodily autonomy supersedes such obligations, that no one has the right to demand his sacrifice no matter how great the potential benefit. Education has remained Franklin's consistent passion across centuries. His belief that an informed citizenry is essential for democratic governance has only strengthened with time and experience. He has taught in various capacities, always anonymously, always under assumed names, sharing knowledge with students who never know their teacher's true identity. He has tutored struggling students, mentored promising scholars, supported educational institutions through anonymous donations. He has created online resources that make knowledge freely available, written textbooks that are released under open licenses, developed educational technologies that personalize learning. He sees in the Internet's potential for democratizing knowledge an echo of what the printing press accomplished in his youth, and he works to ensure that this potential is realized rather than captured by commercial interests. He has established scholarships for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, believing that talent is equally distributed but opportunity is not, that democracy requires mechanisms for social mobility. He thinks about his own education, largely self-directed, accomplished through voracious reading and practical experience, and he wonders if contemporary educational systems have become too rigid, too focused on credentialing rather than learning. He advocates for educational reform, writes essays promoting alternative pedagogies, supports experimental schools that emphasize critical thinking and creativity over rote memorization. He understands that education is political, that curricula reflect power structures and ideological commitments, that debates over what to teach are really debates over what kind of society to build, and he engages in these debates carefully, promoting civic education and scientific literacy and historical understanding, while trying to avoid indoctrination, believing that education should empower students to think for themselves rather than tell them what to think. Art and culture provide Franklin with windows into human experience that pure reason cannot access. He has always appreciated music and literature and visual arts, but his extended life has allowed him to witness entire artistic movements rise and fall, to see how cultural expression reflects and shapes social values. He attended early performances of Beethoven, heard Mozart play piano, watched Wagner opera, listened to jazz emerge in New Orleans and blues develop in the Mississippi Delta. He has seen Impressionism and Cubism and abstract expressionism, has visited museums showing works from every era including his own. He has read every major literary work published in English and many in other languages, has watched theatre evolve from 18th century conventions through realism and absurdism and postmodern experimentation, and through it all he has marveled at human creativity, at the endless capacity to find new ways of expressing the universal themes of love and death, and meaning and beauty. He has tried his own hand at artistic creation over the years, painting and writing and composing, never with exceptional talent, but always with sincere engagement. He understands that art serves purposes beyond entertainment, that it allows humans to process experience and communicate truths that literal language cannot capture. He supports artists financially, buys their work and promotes it to others, believes that a healthy society requires robust cultural production. He attends concerts and galleries and readings, always anonymously, always in the audience rather than on stage, and he absorbs these expressions of the contemporary moment, tries to understand what they reveal about where humanity currently stands, and he wonders what future generations will make of early 21st century culture, whether they will find it profound or shallow, whether our particular obsessions will seem meaningful or trivial from the distance of centuries. Religion remains a complex question for Franklin, who was raised in a Christian context but developed increasingly deistic views during his lifetime. His extended existence has given him time to explore every major faith tradition, to study their texts and practices and philosophical foundations. He has prayed in mosques and meditated in Buddhist temples and participated in Hindu rituals and studied Torah with rabbis and attended Quaker meetings. He has explored indigenous spiritual traditions, learned from shamans and medicine people, tried to understand their relationships with land and ancestors and sacred forces. And through all this exploration he has found wisdom and beauty in every tradition, but also limitations and contradictions, questions that remain unanswered no matter how deeply he probes. His own immortality poses theological problems that existing frameworks cannot adequately address. He is not undead like a vampire or cursed like a fairy tale character, not chosen by God for some special purpose that has been revealed to him. He simply persists, inexplicably, and no religious tradition has a category for someone in his situation. He has asked himself whether his immortality proves anything about metaphysical questions. Does his survival suggest that consciousness can persist beyond normal biological limits? That something like a soul might exist independently of the body? Or is he merely a biological anomaly, a random mutation that happened to produce unaging physiology? He does not know and suspects he can never know, that the ultimate questions about existence and meaning remain beyond human capacity to definitively answer, And so he has settled into a kind of practical agnosticism, living ethically without claiming certainty about cosmic purposes, finding meaning in relationships and projects, and learning rather than in theological systems. He respects religious believers, envies their faith, sometimes, but cannot quite bring himself to accept claims that seem unsupported by evidence. The nature of consciousness increasingly occupies Franklin's thoughts as neuroscience advances and artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated. He wonders what makes him conscious, what generates the subjective experience of being Benjamin Franklin rather than merely processing information like a very sophisticated machine. He studies contemporary theories of consciousness, reads about integrated information theory and global workspace theory and quantum consciousness and panpsychism. He follows debates about whether consciousness is fundamental to the universe or emergent from complex information processing, and he realizes that despite all the progress in neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved, that no one can adequately explain why there is something it is like to be rather than just functional processes occurring in darkness. His own experience provides a single data point, proof that consciousness can persist far beyond normal biological limits. But this observation does not explain the mechanism. He wonders if his consciousness would survive if his brain were destroyed and then regenerated by whatever mechanism makes him immortal. Would he experience continuity, or would a new consciousness emerge in his body? A copy that would not be him despite having all his memories. These questions seem abstract until he considers the possibility of mind uploading, of transferring consciousness to digital substrates. If such technology becomes available, should he attempt it, would the uploaded version be him or merely a simulation of him? And if he uploaded and the biological version survived, which one would be the real Franklin? He has no answers to these questions but cannot stop asking them, cannot stop probing at the mystery of his own existence. He participates in online forums dedicated to consciousness studies, always anonymously, contributing insights from his unique perspective while being careful not to reveal why his perspective is unique. Franklin thinks about endings, about how stories conclude and lives find resolution, and he realizes that his own story may have no ending, that he may persist indefinitely without the narrative closure that death provides for normal humans. This lack of ending disturbs him sometimes, makes him feel that his existence is incomplete, that he is living in an eternal third act that never reaches its climax or resolution. He reads literature obsessively, studying how authors craft satisfying conclusions, wondering if there are lessons he can apply to his own experience. But he realizes that the satisfaction of literary endings depends on finitude, on the sense that time is limited and choices matter because they foreclose other possibilities. His endless time makes choices feel less consequential because there will always be opportunities to try different paths. He wonders if he should artificially create an ending, should write his autobiography and arrange for its publication after deliberately ending his life, giving his story the closure it otherwise lacks. He has drafted such an autobiography multiple times, filling thousands of pages with his experiences across centuries, but he has never been satisfied with any version, never found the right tone or structure, never managed to compress 300 years into a narrative that feels coherent. And he is not sure he is ready to die even if he could arrange it, not sure that his story has reached its natural conclusion, not certain that he has accomplished everything he should accomplish. So he continues, he persists, He lives without ending, and he tries to accept that this state of suspension might be his permanent condition, that he may never experience the resolution that death provides. The present moment stretches out before him, this endless now that contains all of history and points toward all possible futures. Franklin sits in his small apartment, 240 years beyond the death that never came, and he continues learning and teaching and observing, continues trying to contribute to human flourishing in whatever small ways his anonymity permits, continues bearing witness to the American experiment even as he worries it might be failing, continues hoping that humanity will somehow muddle through its current crises and emerge into better futures, continues remembering everyone and everything he has lost while also remaining open to new experiences and relationships, continues wrestling with questions of meaning and purpose and identity, continues adapting to technologies and social changes that would have seemed impossible to his younger self, continues watching the stars turn overhead while wondering if he will ever reach them or if he is condemned to remain earthbound forever. And he does not know when or how his story will end, if it will end. Whether he will persist through centuries more or finally find the oblivion that has eluded him so long. But for now, in this moment, he continues, because that is what he does, what he has always done. He continues, he persists, he endures, this last witness to the founding carrying forward into whatever futures may come, bearing his impossible burden of memory and experience, hoping that somehow, someday, it will all have been worthwhile, that his extended existence will have served some purpose beyond mere continuation, that the American experiment he helped launch will ultimately succeed in its promise to secure liberty and justice for all, even though he knows that such success will require ongoing struggle and sacrifice from generations yet unborn, even though he understands that the work is never finished, that democracy must be continuously renewed, that each generation must choose again to uphold the values and institutions that make self-governance possible, and so he continues into the night that deepens outside his window, into the future that remains uncertain, into the endless flow of time that carries everything forward, including him, the immortal witness, the man who cannot die, the last link to an era now distant enough to seem almost mythical. And the story goes on, and on, and on, without resolution, without conclusion, without end.